I am here with my friend Adam, rightly back in his spot for Plugged In. Hello, Adam.
How are you doing, Andy?
I'm fine. I enjoyed chatting to your colleague last week, but yes, it's nice to see your smiling face return to its place of glory where it should be.
Yes, the place of glory in my garage.
Ab-
It's we all got to play the hand we're dealt. That's the end of the story there.
Well, I wasn't going to draw attention to that part. Right now, we do movie reviews, game reviews, music
Yep.
reviews, musician reviews, YouTube and YouTube channel reviews. And
Yep.
I was actually chatting to someone who might be of interest to you.
Okay.
Um, it's called Go Chatter Studios. And
Okay.
you might be interested. I was interviewing him earlier for a show later on. He's a guy in the UK and he makes stop motion Lego Bible based stories to point people to
Oh,
Jesus.
wow. That's fantastic. All right. Is he on YouTube or where did they show up?
Right. So there's a website, there's also YouTube. So it's
Okay.
not heard it here first, but Go Chatter Studios.
Okay.
They're on
I'm going
Instagram
to
and
make a
they're on
note
there.
of it if I can find a pen.
You might find it of interest, and our listeners might. And our listeners right now might be interested. It'll be on my Get You Home show at some point in the future. But I was thinking about YouTube channels, especially because there's an awful lot of stuff out there. Some of it's okay, a lot of it's
Right.
probably not brilliant, some of it's excellent. But how do we sift through all the stuff?
Well, I mean, I think that the basic principles are the same for everything, right? If you're watching something that you're not familiar with, um, obviously, if there are immediate worldview things that pop up or, content issues, it's like, okay, that's a red flag. And if they come up quickly, in quick succession, uh, it's like, okay, maybe we're going to be out on this. Now, plugged in exists in part so that you don't have to do that work, right? We want to look at it ahead of time for you so that you don't have to, suffer through those unpleasant surprises, if you will. Because none of us like, we like happy surprises. We don't like unpleasant surprises. I don't anyway. I don't really like surprises at all because I'm a control freak. So happy, sad, or otherwise, I want to know what's coming down the pike.
It's why I don't like thrillers. I can't do them. I can't
Right?
cope.
Right? No, that we were watching. Okay, so I'm going to out myself in terms of, okay, here's the real world. One of my daughters has gotten into a show here in the US called The Rookie, which is a cop show, a police officer show. And it's got violence, it's got some language, it's got a little bit of sensuality. It's not too over the top. Um, but it's like 7 seasons of it. And so they're like, oh, goody. We have 7 seasons to catch up on. I'm like, oh, no, I got to watch this thing for 7 seasons with you guys. But I think, with the good shows, hopefully there's character development. There are moral or ethical situations that we can, notice and talk about with our kids. And so there's a process there, right? Some things are going to be out of bounds from the get go. And as our kids get older, maybe we allow more of that content, in because that's the world that we live in. We want to equip them to be able to think critically about it. So anyway, that's a really long-winded answer to your question, but that is my answer.
It's a good one though, because as much as we delve into specific films or channels or whatever, I think just the general idea of as a parent, not even as a parent, as a human being, how do
Yeah.
we approach some of this stuff? Because especially with children, if you say, right, you're never ever doing that, you're not going to do that ever, you're not going to have any part of that, all we're really doing is putting off an explosion of interest in the very thing that we're able to
Right.
control for a short time. And at some point, we'll
Right.
lose that ability to kind of reason or control, and then they'll go and do it in a much bigger way. So,
Right.
not
Well, and let me just riff on that if I can for a second, Andy. I
please.
think um I think our ability to control our children is strongest when they're fairly young. By the time they get to be 12, 13, those early teen years, they're curious, they're smart. As it comes to technology, they may be smarter than us, so even if we put a hard boundary in place, in some ways, it's a little bit Adam and Eve, right? Did God really say, did your parents really say you couldn't do this? And so I think even by the time our kids are into their early teens, our stance is shifting to giving them more agency, but we do it right next to them. It's not like, okay, here's carte blanche to go do what you want, but how do we step into that with them and have a conversation? And there may still be things that are out of bounds. Like my son wanted to go to a party where they were going to be watching American Psycho a couple of years ago. And I just said, bud, it's just sex and violence and language and gratuity. There's nothing redemptive there. So I think no on that. But there are other things that he has wanted to watch. I'm like, okay, I have some questions about that, but let's watch that. Let's talk about it. And so what we're modeling is not this knee-jerk reaction of no, 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 which does ultimately produce, I think, a rebellious response in maybe not all kids, but a lot of kids. But we want to protect you for particular reasons. And we also want to be wise about the world and equip you to deal with it so that when you're out there on your own, you've actually had some practice under our house, and it's not something that you're just rushing into gleefully because mom and dad never let you do it before.
The example that does come to my mind quite clearly, I remember as a child, where there were railings at the side of the road, big metal
Yeah.
ones, and you
Yep.
couldn't just walk into the road. Okay, so
Right.
separation from road, pavement, sidewalk is a very healthy thing when you're very little. And
Yep.
one of the things they realised is these railings were actually very dangerous. They're set apart every foot or so, or whatever it happened to be. And as you try and look along the side of that, you can't see through. So what they
Right.
did was they actually staggered them so that if you look at it diagonally, you can see through to see the cars. It
Uh-huh.
actually gave people who were very short an ability to see the road. But the reason why this came to mind is children do not have the same perception of
Right.
speed that adults do. And the reason has got nothing to do with brain power or intelligence. It's literally down to height. And the
Hmm.
shorter you are, the greater the danger is. You're not going to be able to judge the distance and the speed like an adult or just a taller person
Right.
would. And I think, in a sense, that kind of illustrates something of what we're saying. We want to see through the railings, but we can't. And there are ways that we can see through diagonally. It's a bit safer. But actually, adults, taller people, basically on that one, actually have a better perspective, not because of anything other than
Yep.
height or perhaps a little bit of age.
Well, and I'll add to the metaphor. I rode motorcycles for 10 years, and I remember in the motorcycle safety training class that we took, the instructor talked about target fixation,
Mm,
right? Something happens in front of you that you need to avoid, but if you're looking right at it, you're going to go where you're looking.
mm.
And in some ways I think that there's a corollary with if all we ever tell our kids is no, don't look at that, no, don't look at that, no, don't look at that, you know, it almost awakens this desire to see, well, what is it? Why not? Whereas if we can look past the obstacle, it's not that we ignore it or that we try to deny that it's there, but we don't make it the center focal point in our conversations, and we move safely past it. So I've always really liked that metaphor. And interestingly enough, this is just geeky. Our perception of speed diminishes the further ahead that we look. And so they said if you're ever in a turn and you feel like you're out of control, just lifting your head up and looking further down the turn can help you get stabilized because it affects your perception of speed, which is exactly what you're talking about with height. Whereas if I'm looking straight down at something, um, I can freak out. And I think, again, as parents, when all we're doing is looking at this thing that makes us freak out, as opposed to looking up at the bigger perspective, we all know kids, or maybe we had parents that freaked out about everything. Um, and after a while, your kids don't even hear you anymore, right? Because you just get angry about everything. I'm like, all right, whatever. It's just they hate everything. So, um, There you go. Thank you for letting me do my little motorcycle riff on
No,
that.
it's fine. I did motorbike training and we had the same thing. Never look at your front wheel. Yes, have a scan what's ahead of you. It's
Right.
good, but you don't want to be focusing there. You want to be focusing exactly as you said, where you want to go
Yep.
down the road. Aim for that, not the
Yep.
bit in front of your wheel because it's more stable. It's that
Yep.
simple.
Yep. It's that simple.
And that's what we're talking about by using plugged in we haven't done any reviews yet, as a way of helping us to understand things is that children, young people don't have the same perspective, not because they're less intelligent or because we're better
Right.
than them, but it's literally we have the ability from height essentially to see further down the road. I'm not talking
Yep.
exclusively about height here, but we've just seen a few more things. We're able to have a bit more experience and knowledge. So it's about protecting people around us.
Yep.
Shall we do a review since that's what we're actually supposed to be doing?
Yeah, let's talk about that. So one of the things that we have seen this week is a new show on Amazon Prime or Prime Video, I guess it's called. It's Amazon's video service called House of David. And just as we have seen with multiple seasons of The Chosen now, which was brought to us by creator Dallas Jenkins, we now have a show that has some broad similarities streaming on Amazon Prime that tells the story of David. And it is directed by John Irwin, and John and Andy Irwin have brought us movies like Jesus Revolution, I Can Only Imagine. Their production company, Kingdom Story, did The Unbreakable Boy, which I think you and Paul talked about last week. So John is coming from a very faith-oriented perspective. And so now we have this new series on Prime Video that unpacks David's life. And I think that there are a lot of broad similarities with The Chosen, and that there are going to be moments where you're like, aha, I recognize that. That's what I have read in the Bible. And there'll be other moments where they take dramatic license and maybe imagine something in such a way that it's like, well, I never thought about it like that before. It doesn't make it necessarily wrong, but it is a dramatic interpretation that fleshes out things that may or may not be fully revealed in scripture. And it's interesting. We hear it plugged in from two kinds of people. There are some people that love that, right? It's like, oh, it really helped me to envision a particular scene. And then there are others that will say, well, that's not actually in the Bible, so I'm not going to watch that. And I think that there's some legitimacy to both perspectives. And even as you're listening or watching today, you know kind of which side you're on. But I do think that these efforts, whether it's on television or in theaters, really do enable us to potentially see something from a new perspective. And hopefully we're also grounded enough in scripture that if something is, deviates from scripture in some way, we're able to evaluate, what do we think about that, and help our kids think about that as well if they're watching too.
Cool. Okay. Have you got something else for us
I do.
to finish with?
Let's talk about something very big, biggest ever, that you may or may not have heard about. Have you heard of Nutcha 2?
No.
So it's spelled Nezha. This is a Chinese animated movie.
I don't even spell it.
But I actually looked it up on the good old internet, and it's pronounced Nutcha 2, as in the number 2, because it's the second one. This is now the biggest animated movie globally of all time. It just passed Inside Out 2. It's done over $2 billion worth of box office, much of it in China. And it's an incredibly dense story about a boy who is also a demon. But here he's taking on a godlike character who's in a heaven-like place, who's actually kind of the bad guy. And that's like the super, 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 super short version of an incredibly dense Chinese mythological story that has dragons and battles and characters and reincarnation and all kinds of spiritual stuff woven into it that sort of feels like a little bit manga, a little bit Star Wars, and a little bit Greek mythology, with a lot of Chinese culture interwoven throughout. And so we're trying to cover things that are big, not only necessarily in the United States, but this thing has been huge, and it's showing in theaters here in the States. And My guess is that you have some listeners and some viewers who are familiar with it. It's pretty violent. There is some language. It probably would be what we would call a PG-13 movie, but it's not rated. But obviously, that spirituality element is the one that different families may have different perspectives on, right? Just like with anything that has to do with magic or spirituality, we have to have a frame of reference for how do we think about that. Do we treat it like Greek mythology, or is it in a different category? So Paul Lacey's done a terrific job of unpacking the incredible amount of detail in the plot of this movie. But it's another one that pretty interesting, where they go with it. And it's an interesting story in that it's just a massive thing on a global scale.
Had never heard of it, but hey, that doesn't necessarily mean a thing if I do or don't. But that's why we have you. Thank you, Adam. This is why I really enjoy these particular segments, because just right at the beginning of this, rather than just going into reviews of this channel or that song or that film, I think it is good just every so often just to retouch on the fact that, you know what, how do we make good decisions?
Yep.
We either close off everything and create potentially rebellion in the child later on, even ourselves, or
Right.
actually not, we drip feed them a little bit of burning from a fire and then they'll learn properly. We're not talking about that. Stay away from flames. It's going to hurt you. But I do remember one of my boys, we had a coal fire and he would not stop going near it. And in the end, I let the poker get not burning hot, but hot enough that I thought he won't like that. I let him touch it and he dropped it. And in the end, it was like, well, I can say no so many times. And you know what? This is a lesson he needs to learn. He didn't burn himself, by the way, if anybody was right.
It was, we don't need to call the police to come get you.
It wasn't that hot, but it was certainly hot enough that he was like, "Ooh, that's not cold."
Right.
And, sometimes we do need a little bit of a help for people, because we can say no so many times, but eventually people need to learn for themselves to some degree. He was little. He never got burned. It was never near enough hot enough for that. Just restating that once more. But it was enough to teach him a lesson. But we're trying to avoid some of those unpleasant lessons, which could happen. That's what we're doing, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say too, parenthood is an imprecise science. It's more art than science. And none of us want to make mistakes, right? But every parent will look back and say, man, we tried, but we got this wrong. And thankfully, because we're in relationship with a gracious God, there's forgiveness and there are second chances. And sometimes as parents, we have to ask our kids to forgive us. It goes both ways. So the goal is not perfection, but the goal is really developing our relationship with our kids and helping them develop a relationship with God so that they can make good decisions in these areas when they're out on their own.
Adam, as ever, thank you. How do people get hold of all the wonderful reviews that they can get hold of on your website?
You can come to pluggedin.com and you'll find all that stuff there. We also have a weekly podcast, thepluggedinshow.com, and we are a part of a ministry here in the United States and around the world called Focus on the Family.
Adam, Plugged In, thank you kindly. We'll see you again next week, sir.
Thanks, Andy.
Pure Media, the magazine, is hand-perfected with some of the finest writers from around the world that we could find. And yes, Andy B too. New editions are released just for you on the first Friday of every month, from our family to your family. Pure Media, the magazine, is available now. Sign up for free at puremediafamily.com/magazine.